I know what you're thinking. Another frost warning, another cold snap, another video about covering your tomatoes and protecting your orchards. Here's the thing. This one is different. And I need you to understand why. More temperature swings are in progress for the Midwest and Northeast, including a significant cool down through late week that could bring frosty mornings to some areas. This spring has delivered several setbacks. There is some good news. The temperature dips will not be as extreme as in recent weeks. Less extreme than recent weeks. That sounds reassuring until you understand what the previous weeks actually did. Wave 1, the first cold snap of May, delivered hard freezes of 28 degrees or below across the Dakotas and western Nebraska, with frost reaching the Ohio Valley and northern Texas panhandle. Wave 2, just days ago, followed with another round of below normal temperatures across the eastern half of the country that the CPC confirmed in their 6 to 10 day outlook. And now Wave 3 is arriving. Frosty mornings forecast for portions of the Midwest and Northeast late this week, in a spring where plant tissue has been repeatedly cold stressed, in a spring where apple orchards bloom 2 to 3 weeks ahead of schedule in April's record warmth, in a spring where gardeners across the Ohio Valley put warm season crops in the ground in mid-April, believing the worst of the cold was behind them. Spring often brings a tug-of-war between lingering winter chill and building summer warmth across the northern United States. The transition can be frustrating for warm weather fans, and after a rough winter, many are still waiting for consistent warm conditions. This spring has delivered several setbacks. That may be the most understated characterization of 2026 spring temperature pattern in any official or journalistic document I have read. A January polar vortex displacement that killed 22 people and caused $4 billion in damage. The warmest March in 132 years. Record April heat followed immediately by hard freezes. 3 separate cold waves in May targeting vegetation that is already compromised from the first 2. And now a 4th cold surge late this week that AccuWeather is flagging as capable of frosty mornings across the Midwest and Northeast. Today is Friday, May 8th, 2026. The 3rd frost threat of May is approaching. And the reason it is dangerous is not just what it is alone. It is what it is on top of everything that came before it. Before I get into the specifics of this week's frost threat, I want to paint the full picture of what this spring has done to temperatures, because I think most people are only aware of the individual events and not the cumulative pattern they form. After a stretch of July and August-like warmth, the heat in the mid-Atlantic peaked, and then a cross-country cold front brought cooler air. The shift in temperatures felt more like a changing of the seasons, with widespread summer-like conditions during the day followed by nighttime lows more typical of late winter or early spring. For some locations, this was a 50 to 60 degree temperature drop, 50 to 60 degrees in 24 to 48 hours. From summer-like warmth to late winter chill, that is not a seasonal transition. That is a meteorological whiplash event. And it happened, not once, but multiple times across this spring. In a span of 24 to 48 hours, temperatures will swing from feeling like June or July to more like March. While the cold snap will be brief, it could have damaging consequences. Brief, but damaging. That is the consistent characterization of every cold wave this spring. Brief, lasting 24 to 72 hours before temperatures rebound, but damaging, because the vegetation exposed to each wave is increasingly vulnerable to even modest cold stress after repeated events. And here is the agricultural science behind why the 3rd wave matters most, even when it is the least extreme. When a plant survives a frost event, say 33 degrees on May the 2nd, it experiences cellular stress. The ice crystals that form in the intercellular spaces damage cell membranes. The plant's ability to regulate water uptake and photosynthesis is compromised. Over the next several days, as temperatures rebound, the plant attempts to repair itself. New cellular growth is tender and poorly hardened, actually more vulnerable than pre-frost tissue in some ways. Then Wave 2 arrives. The already damaged tissue faces another cold night. The threshold for lethal damage has dropped from 32 degrees to perhaps 34 or 35 degrees because the tissue's cold tolerance has been compromised. What would have been a non-damaging 34-degree night in April becomes a damaging event in May on triple-stressed tissue. And now Wave 3, a frost threat arriving on vegetation that has been through 2 previous cold waves in the span of 10 days. The cumulative cold injury concept is real, documented, and directly applicable to what is building for this weekend across the Midwest and Northeast. Let me be specific about which communities and which agricultural systems face the highest risk from this week's frost threat, because the geographic footprint of Wave 3 aligns with some of the most important agricultural production corridors in the eastern United States: apple, peach, and cherry orchards, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New York, Virginia. The cold air could potentially damage plants and vegetation, as much of the central and eastern half of the country has seen an early start to the season. Spring leaves and flowers have already begun to bloom, so any frost could spell trouble. The fruit orchards of the Great Lakes and Appalachian corridor are in the most vulnerable agricultural situation of the entire spring right now. After April's record warmth accelerated bloom by 2 to 3 weeks, these orchards entered the fruitlet stage, where pollinated blossoms have set and small green fruits are developing earlier than normal. Fruitlets are significantly more frost-tolerant than open blossoms, but they are not immune. A hard frost below 28 degrees can still kill developing apple fruitlets, and a softer frost, 30 to 32 degrees, on top of fruitlets already stressed by 2 previous cold waves, can cause partial damage that reduces crop yield without completely destroying it. The economic calculus is brutal. Partial crop damage is often more financially damaging than total crop loss, because the farmer still bears full production costs, but receives reduced revenue. An orchard that loses 40% of its fruitlets to cumulative cold injury produces 40% fewer apples, but still requires the same labor, fuel, equipment, and irrigation costs to bring the surviving crop to harvest. It is the agricultural equivalent of paying for a full ticket and being seated in a half-empty theater. Vineyards, Finger Lakes, Hudson Valley, Virginia wine country, Lake Erie, Ava, grapevine shoots that survived the previous 2 frost waves, are now carrying 4 to 6 inches of new growth. Each wave of cold has forced the vine to redirect energy from the primary buds that produce the best fruit to secondary and tertiary buds with lower yield potential. Wave 3, arriving now on vines that are already compensating for previous cold damage, threatens to push some of the region's most productive varietals past the point where they can produce an economically viable crop this season. New York's Finger Lakes wine region, Virginia's Shenandoah Valley AVA, and Pennsylvania's Lake Erie grape-growing corridor are all in the footprint of Wave 3's frost threat. Vineyard managers who have been fighting this spring's cold wave since late April are facing the possibility that Wave 3 is the wave that determines the character of the 2026 vintage. Home vegetable gardens, the entire Ohio Valley, Mid-Atlantic, and Northeast. The National Weather Service in Des Moines, Iowa, recently issued freeze warnings intended to alert backyard growers of the potential problems caused by the late-season cold snap. Every home gardener in Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, New York, and New England who planted tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, basil, or cucumbers in April's record warmth is facing a 3rd round of overnight frost threat. The plants that survived waves 1 and 2 are not the same plants they were in April. They have been cold stressed repeatedly. Their cellular integrity is compromised, and they are now being asked to survive a 3rd cold event. A tomato plant that loses its growing tip to frost on May 10th is not the same as a tomato plant that loses its growing tip in March. By May 10th, the plant has invested significant energy in root development and initial canopy growth. The damage is real, and the recovery takes time. The plant doesn't have, if you want a productive summer harvest. The Plains winter wheat, Nebraska, Kansas, the Dakotas, hundreds of thousands of residents across the upper Midwest are waking up under urgent weather alerts as freeze conditions sweep across 5 states. The National Weather Service has issued freeze warnings in North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Wyoming, and Minnesota, with temperatures expected to plunge into the low 30s and upper 20s in some areas. Upper 20s in the Dakotas. Again, the winter wheat that I described as being under freeze stress at its jointing stage during Wave 1 is now potentially facing a 3rd cold event. Wheat at the jointing and boot stage is most vulnerable to freeze damage at the growing point. The cumulative stress of 3 cold waves across the Dakotas and Nebraska during the critical spring growth period will be visible in yield data when harvest arrives in June and July. It is already being watched by USDA crop condition reporters across the northern plains. I want to spend time on something genuinely new and genuinely hopeful that AccuWeather reported this week, because in a spring of relentless bad news, there is some genuinely interesting science trying to address exactly the problem I've been describing. New technology aims to protect crops from sudden spring freezes. AccuWeather's Ali Reed reports on a company testing foam designed to shield plants from extreme cold, offering farmers a potential lifeline: foam. Not a greenhouse, not irrigation frost protection, not wind machines. Foam. A biodegradable, lightweight protective foam that can be applied to fruit trees, berry bushes, and row crops to create a thermal buffer against overnight temperature drops. The foam insulates the plant tissue in a way that mimics several inches of snow cover, trapping the soil's residual warmth around the vulnerable growing tissue and preventing the convective heat loss that drives radiation frost damage. This technology is still in testing phases. It is not yet commercially available at scale, but the fact that it is being actively tested and covered by AccuWeather in the context of the 2026 spring's repeated frost events is significant, because it represents the agricultural sector responding in real time to the problem that I have been documenting all spring. The temperature volatility of 2026 is not just a weather story. It is driving innovation in agricultural protection technologies because the people who grow food for this country are recognizing that the old patterns, plant after last frost, rely on average dates, are no longer reliable guides in an era of amplified temperature swings. For home gardeners who cannot access commercial foam protection systems, the principles are the same. Create a thermal buffer between the plant and the cold air. Row covers, frost cloth, cold frames, even overturned buckets placed over individual seedlings before sunset trap enough soil heat to provide meaningful frost protection. The physics are identical, insulate the microclimate around the plant. The title of the AccuWeather article, published May 5th and updated May 7th, captures something I want to explain in plain terms. From 80s to frost, temperature roller coaster this week in Northeast, Midwest. 80 degrees on one day, frost on a morning a few days later. Let me explain why the specific pattern, the sharp warm to cold oscillation, is more damaging to plants than either sustained cold or a gradual transition to cold would be. When temperatures are consistently cold, plants maintain their cold hardening, a physiological state where cells have adjusted their water content and membrane composition to resist freezing. Cold hardened plants can survive temperatures significantly below freezing. The problem occurs when warm temperatures break down that cold hardening before the final frosts have passed. After a stretch of July and August-like warmth, temperatures swung back to levels more typical of late winter or early spring in a span of 24 to 48 hours. The cold air could potentially damage plants and vegetation, as much of the central and eastern half of the country has seen an early start to the season. When plants experienced July-like warmth in April, which is exactly what happened when Philadelphia hit 91 degrees and Baltimore hit 93 degrees in the record April heat wave, the cold hardening that has built up through winter and early spring completely breaks down. The plant is operating in full summer growth mode. Every new shoot, every new blossom, every new fruitlet is produced in the assumption that summer has arrived and the cold is finished. Then 30 degrees arrives 3 days later, on tissue that has zero cold hardening because 91 degree warmth told it summer was here. That is the specific mechanism that makes the 80s to frost pattern so destructive. It is not the frost alone. It is the false security of the preceding warmth that stripped the plant of its cold defense and left it fully exposed. Spring often brings a tug of war between lingering winter chill and building summer warmth. After a rough winter, many are still waiting for consistent warm conditions. This spring has delivered several setbacks. Several setbacks is a very kind way of describing what the 2026 spring temperature pattern has done to agriculture across the central and eastern United States. The January polar vortex displacement, the record March heat wave, the record April warmth driving premature bloom across the entire fruit belt from Georgia to New England. And then 3 separate cold waves in May targeting vegetation that April told was safe. The roller coaster is still running, and the frosty mornings arriving this late week are its third descent since the season's warmth peaked. I want to address something that comes up every time frost occurs in May, because it creates confusion about risk and preparedness. People look at the last frost date for their location and think, it's past that date, I'm safe. And this spring has demonstrated repeatedly and definitively that is not how last frost dates work. An earlier than normal last frost suggests freezing temperatures may end sooner than average. This creates opportunities for earlier garden activities, but brief cold snaps are still possible. Have frost protection ready. Row covers, cloches, and cold frames protect seedlings on chilly nights. Brief cold snaps are still possible, even after the average last frost date, even after what feels like spring has fully arrived. The Old Farmer's Almanac is being honest about something that average dates conceal. The average last frost date is not a guarantee. It is the date on which 50% of years historically have seen their last freeze. That means 50% of years have seen frost after that date. In a year like 2026, where the temperature pattern is defined by extraordinary volatility, 50 to 60 degree temperature swings, and a large-scale atmospheric circulation pattern that keeps the Canadian trough active well into May, the probability of late-season frost is significantly elevated compared to an average year. The last frost date calculated from historical averages was built from decades of data that did not include 2026's extraordinary temperature oscillation pattern. Check soil temperature. Soil can remain cool, wait on warm season transplants, until the soil is consistently warm. Gradually harden off seedlings, acclimate indoor starts before transplanting. The soil temperature advice is critically important and almost never discussed. The overnight air temperatures that drive frost advisories tell you about frost damage risk, but soil temperature tells you whether transplanted warm season crops can actually establish and thrive. After 3 cold waves in May on top of April's record warmth followed by sudden cold, the soil temperature in the Ohio Valley and Northeast is inconsistent. Some areas have warm soils from April's heat. Others have been repeatedly cooled by cold air advection. Warm season crops transplanted into soil below 60 degrees Fahrenheit will struggle regardless of whether frost damages their foliage. Let me be direct and specific about what you need to do in the next 24 to 36 hours, because the frost threat is arriving tonight into Saturday morning, and again, potentially Saturday night into Sunday morning. Cover your warm season vegetables. Tonight, before sunset. If you have tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, cucumbers, squash, beans, or basil anywhere in Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, New York, New Jersey, or New England, cover them tonight before you go to sleep. Row covers, frost cloth, old bed sheets, plastic sheeting held off the foliage, any of these provide meaningful frost protection. The most important rule is to cover before the temperature drops, not after you see frost forming. By the time you see frost, the temperature has already been at 32 degrees for long enough to have caused damage. Check the NWS frost advisory and freeze warning status for your specific county, not your state, not your region, your specific county. The frost line is not a smooth boundary. It follows terrain, urban heat islands, lake effect patterns, and local topography in ways that produce significant variation within a single metropolitan area. The NWS frost and freeze program issues warnings by county-based forecast zones. Know your county. Check it. For fruit orchard managers, assess Wave 2 damage before Wave 3 arrives. The most important agricultural task for orchard managers in the Great Lakes and Appalachian fruit belt today is assessing the fruitlet condition from Waves 1 and 2. Cut cross-sections of developing fruitlets. Look for browning at the seed or embryo, the telltale sign of freeze-killed tissue. Know your damage percentage going into Wave 3. This matters for crop insurance documentation, for management decisions about thinning and irrigation, and for understanding how much additional damage Wave 3 can deliver on top of what already exists. For the northern plains, Dakotas, Nebraska, northern Kansas, forecasters warned that temperatures could fall as low as 29 degrees, threatening crops, sensitive plants, and even unprotected outdoor plumbing. Cities under freeze warnings include Grand Forks, Williston, Dickinson, Bismarck, and Crosby. 29 degrees in the Dakotas, again, for the third time in May. Protect outdoor plumbing, protect any transplanted seedlings, and continue monitoring winter wheat fields for cumulative freeze injury at the boot stage. Here is where we stand, Friday, May 8th, 2026. The third cold wave of May is arriving this weekend. AccuWeather published their most current frost analysis on May 5th and updated it May 7th. More temperature swings in progress for the Midwest and Northeast, including a significant cool down through late week that could bring frosty mornings to some areas. This spring has delivered several setbacks. There is some good news. The temperature dips will not be as extreme as in recent weeks. Less extreme than recent weeks? That is the silver lining. The hard freezes of 28 degrees or below that characterized Wave 1 across the northern plains are not expected to repeat this weekend. The values being discussed are frost advisory range, low to mid-30s, rather than freeze warning range. That distinction matters. Mid-30s on healthy, cold-hardened vegetation is survivable. Mid-30s on vegetation that has been repeatedly stressed by 2 previous waves is a different calculation. The cumulative cold injury concept has been the defining agricultural story of this spring that almost nobody is covering. Not because the individual events are less severe than the tornado outbreaks dominating the headlines, but because cold moves silently and slowly. It doesn't produce dramatic radar signatures or storm chaser videos. It just arrives in the dark on a quiet Friday night, and by Saturday morning, the tomato plant you spent 3 weeks growing from seed is black and collapsed. Cover your plants tonight. Check your orchard tomorrow morning. Watch the NWS frost advisory for your county through the weekend, and understand that the temperature roller coaster of 2026, from the January polar vortex to the record March heat wave to April's summer-like warmth to 3 May cold waves in 10 days, is the same restless, energized, amplified atmosphere that has been driving this entire extraordinary season. It does not quiet down because you're tired of the swings. It just keeps oscillating. The frost advisory is real. The risk to your plants is real. And the window to protect them is tonight. Stay safe. Protect your garden. And I will see you in the next update.